Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Uni4Me live session. And I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Kate Walchester from Liverpool John Moores University, who's going to be talking to us about Frankenstein, and Dr. Mark Brown from Staffordshire University, who's going to be talking to us about the joys of poetry. And we also have with us Sally Ward from Staffordshire University. And we'll be taking some questions towards the end. So without any further ado, I shall pass over to Dr. Kate Walchester.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. So, could one of my colleagues indicate that they can see the screen? That would be really helpful. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about a very popular A-level text and indeed popular undergraduate text, Frankenstein. We teach it on our second year Romanticism course. And I'm going to bring together two important themes, really, the Gothic, which is obviously the genre of Frankenstein, with nature, the theme of nature, which I know is a very popular topic for people to consider this particular perspective to study this text from. So I'm bringing together these in an eco-critical reading, which sounds quite grand, but it's just a really useful way of bringing together these two ideas. So I'm going to call this the eco-Gothic. I think it has been called the eco-Gothic elsewhere. And what is that? Well, in this definition that I've got on the screen, there's a kind of bringing together of those two important aspects of this text of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So what David Del Principe says is an eco-Gothic approach poses a challenge to familiar Gothic subject, nature, taking a non-anthropocentric position to reconsider the role that environment, species and non-humans play in the construction of monstrosity and fear. So basically we're just going to be thinking about the Gothic, thinking about the horror in Frankenstein from not from the position of human beings, the anthropocentric position. We're going to think about it from the position of nature, from the environment, from non-humans. So this is what the order I'm going to talk through some ideas, and hopefully these ideas will be useful for whichever perspective you come to Frankenstein from in your writing and your exam preparations. So I'm going to think about some of the dominant critical readings of Frankenstein, so some of those important topics. I'm going to briefly talk about Mary Shelley's biography and how that's had an impact on the way that we've thought about Frankenstein over the centuries. Then I'm going to be thinking about Frankenstein in terms of its context, its historical context of the early 19th century and what was happening in science in that period. And then I'm going to be more closely looking at nature and the environment in Frankenstein and how it appears as a motif, how it informs the characterization and the plot. Okay, so you'll be very familiar with the kind of popular iconography of Frankenstein. Everybody knows what Frankenstein is, I think, in the English speaking and the non-English speaking world. But many times, obviously, as you'll know through your own studies of the text, the monster quite often gets confused. The name of the monster gets confused with the name of the protagonist. So the protagonist, the maker of Frankenstein, is Dr. Frankenstein. So the maker of the monster is Dr. Frankenstein, and quite often the monster himself gets labelled Frankenstein. So we get a kind of blurring and those two identities becoming enmeshed in people's understanding and the popular understandings of Frankenstein. Obviously, you've read the text, you know differently. You know that the doctor is Dr. Frankenstein and the monster is the monster. Okay, It's first of all, thinking through some of those ways that this text has been considered over the centuries since its publication. One of the ways in which this text has been thought about by a critic, very famous critic of and academic who wrote a lot about the Gothic, particularly in the 1990s, Fred Botting, thought about the text as itself a kind of monster, in that it's been put together from lots of different sorts of texts itself. So Mary Shelley had read a huge amount of different Gothic texts, different literary texts and classic texts, and had put those together, and you can find traces of those in the text itself of Frankenstein. So like Fred Botting writes here, it is an assemblage, a putting together of fragments, he puts at the end, a disunified text that subverts the possibility and implications of textual and semantic coherence. So a text that's almost beyond our understanding, because it is a bringing together of lots of different things, lots of different ideas. And you can see, hopefully, if you'll be able to look through these slides. There's far too much information on some of them for you to think about and to write down as I'm talking. So obviously, you can revisit these and see some of these Gothic images and texts which had inspired and were brought together in the text of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Okay, another way in which the text has been thought about is in terms of its subheading. So on the title page, here's the one of the original title pages, I think in the second, probably in a second edition, because this is 1818. You can see here how the title of the text, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, is there, and obviously it's in 3 volumes, with a little quotation from John Milton's Paradise Lost. This is all very important for Mary Shelley's project. The fact that she names the subheading of the text is referring to the classical character Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and took it back to earth and was punished for that transgression. So the title, when Mary Shelley's writing and thinking about her text, she's seen Dr. Frankenstein as audacious, doing something which is beyond the expectations, beyond convention, beyond morality even, in attempting to make a life from the dead bodies of humans and animals and putting those together to try and create life in a non-natural way. So that's one of the sort of ways that academics, critics have thought about this text, is in that sense of this being a critique of science. It's been a sort of that Dr. Frankenstein was overreaching his remit as a scientist by trying to create life. And here we have in the a reproduction of a little extract from the preface, the bit before the text that Mary Shelley wrote in 1831. And here she gives the background to the story of how she sort of dreamed up this text. And the important thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and just sort of link to the last slide, is this final sentence: frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. So here again, she's hinting of a sort of disapproval and the terrifying prospect of someone trying to create life. And in this case, as you can see, the creator's got a capital C. It's referring to a sort of Christian God. So it's kind of ungodly to try and create life outside of a natural way, which is all speaking to our idea of nature and how this text talks about nature. Okay, so moving on to Mary Shelley's biography. Again, I don't want to tell you all her life story, you can find that elsewhere. But this is really to draw your attention to another way in which the text has been considered over the centuries, and that is, particularly by feminist critics, as a kind of birth myth. A myth or a story about creating new life, about women's place as bearing children. And as you can see, I think just the fact of the children in this and the deaths of those children sort of jump out of this bit of the biography, so that in just a few years you can see that Mary has several children who die in infancy, and then has other successful pregnancies later on. So many feminist critics have seen this text as Mary Shelley, and I think we're aware of Mary Shelley's own mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, a famous travel writer and feminist and educationalist, who died only a few days after giving birth to her daughter, Mary, who became Mary Godwin, who became Mary Shelley. So Mary Shelley had grown up with this legacy of, in a way, being responsible for her own mother's death, that her mother died having given birth to her. And so some critics have seen this as a rewriting, a sort of exploration of a birth without a mother, the fact that Frankenstein's monster is made without a mother. And the final sort of contextual thing I'd like you to think about is some of the intertexts and the ways that other books appear within this. So this is sort of going back to this idea of the assemblage of texts being unnaturally brought together. And in the text, the monster finds lots of different texts that he reads and educates himself with, one of which is Volney's Ruin of Empires. And so I suppose we could see that this, I think, informs the ideas that things are falling apart, things are, we're re-understanding the world, and this is a point at which human beings need to sort of stand and can reconsider their position in relation to science and empire and history in general. So he reads a lot about history, and obviously the Paradise Lost is about a fall from grace, a fall from heaven. Okay, science. So in this period, I have to hurry up now. In this period, we've got a large science and investigation, experimentation had been very important since the 18th century, and so here you can see a series of slides which refer to some of the experiments which were being done. One, coincidentally, which has been highlighted by a scholar called Richard Holmes, and it's about experiments into electricity, which obviously is one of those images which we associate very strongly with the birth of the monster, if you like. And also, this is a time when people are worrying about, thinking about, writing about and creating images from nature, automatons, and as you can see here, a little boy an automaton who writes. So the ultimate sort of transgression of nature is to try and make a machine that does that human thing of writing and having creating something on the page. So let's get into the sort of more the eco-critical reading, and I'm going to point you to some texts that talk about this. We've been talking about this sort of quite recently in recent scholarship. One of the things that's quite interesting about the text is that obviously it's produced in an iconic setting in the Villa Diodati near to Lake Geneva, with a group of young people, Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Byron, and so on. And they all come up with these ghost stories. Mary Shelley's is obviously Frankenstein. but it was a really wet, miserable time, really wet summer. The weather was very bad, and that was the provenance of the text. That's why during the summer they had to stay inside and write ghost stories. And the reason for the bad weather was that a volcano had erupted and affected the weather really badly in Europe for 1816 and 1817. Crops failed, but that was the reason that the group stayed inside. So the provenance of this text, the cause of it, was the fact that nature forced everyone inside away from all the rain and storms that are affecting Europe during that period. Some ways that the text has been thought about as well from eco-critical perspective, so the perspective of the non-human. Petschke here looks in an article, had thought about the text from the relation of the non-human or the animal, in that, and this is a tiny detail which I think is really quite interesting, is he looked at this from the point of being a vegetarian, that the monster himself is made partly from animal remains that have come from factory produced meat, and also that the monster himself is vegetarian. He goes on the mountains and he's eating leaves and other sort of vegetable matter, yet he's seen as carnivorous and predatory, and the characters in the text are really worried about him, that he's going to become dangerous, and it's only after human intervention that he does become predatory and tries to fight against the people who created him. Another thing to think about in terms of the setting and how nature is presented is how nature acts on the characters. And I've picked out a couple of examples of environments that are particularly poignant, I think, in the text and stand out to us. One of which is the Arctic setting. And as you'll know, the book is kind of the narrative itself, Victor Frankenstein's narrative, is bookended by these accounts by Walton, the explorer, who's going on an Arctic mission, and there's that sense that this is a desolate, scary landscape, which, as Anne Mallour has written, it sort of is there to punish Victor Frankenstein, because he realizes there when he's in he runs to the Arctic, and it's there that he's going to meet his end. And obviously it's the end of the monster as well. The monster is set adrift on his bit of ice, presumably to his death as well. And the other setting that I wanted to talk about a little bit is about the area around Chamonix and Mont Blanc, and it's there where Victor meets the monster for the first time. The monster, it seems to be the natural place for the monster to hide away and to try and learn about the world before he meets people. And this is the place where glacier, and a time when glaciers were it was still this time of the mini ice age, so it was very, very cold in Europe still to the 1850s. And the glaciers were advancing down that valley, eating up the villages. Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley had been to that area in 1816 and had seen the devastation that the glaciers caused. So it's quite difficult for us in our world of climate change to think of glaciers being a threat, but moving forward. But actually, in that period, they were, and so they're seen as something sublime and terrible and fearsome and capable of destroying human beings. And it's no coincidence, I think, that Mary Shelley sets that meeting between the two characters in the mountains. The monster says the desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. And obviously this connects to something you will have heard of in relation to nature in the Romantic period, the idea of the sublime landscape, somewhere that is both terrifying, awesome, it makes us reflect on our own position as human beings in a natural and from Mary Shelley's perspective, a God-created world. So I'm going to summarise very quickly. Wanted to, in this short lecture, talk to you about some of the important ways that Frankenstein's been read. It's been seen as a birth myth, and that kind of a critique of that approach. That it plays out, it articulates some fears about the impact of science and what that might have, the implications that might have on humanity in the later 19th century. And also drawing attention to nature as a theme which is both terrifying, powerful, and a different rendition, not through poetry. Usually the sublime is written about in romantic poetry, but here the sublime is articulated through this Gothic horror story. So I'll stop there. I hope that that's been useful and that you'll be able to have a look at the slides in due course.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was really interesting. I think it's one of those novels that hasn't just had an impact on literature, but also, as you point out, on popular culture. Kind of it's and for someone who was writing at that time, although women were becoming more into the forefront of writing and less use of pen names, writing in their own right, she was very much a forerunner. And it's incredible that she wrote that book or started it when she was only 18. So thank you for that. We're going to move on to hear from Dr. Mark Brown from Staffordshire University, who's going to look at some poetry with us this afternoon. So, Mark.
Thank you very much, Martin. I've made a short film because I'm not as disciplined as Kate, so I shall play that now, and I shall share my screen. Hello, I'm Mark Brown, and I'm a lecturer in English and American literature at Staffordshire University. I want to talk to you today about poetry and how rewarding it can be, about how careful reading, time spent with a poem can reveal great beauty and great complexity. Poetry can bring joy and satisfaction, and we should never be afraid of it. If you enjoy poetry, you're more likely to be able to analyse it effectively. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the ways that you might approach a poem, and in approaching it in a methodical way, knowledgeable about compositional aspects of the poem, then you will reach new and more interesting interpretations. Some people feel that poetry is difficult and mysterious, that somehow the poet is hiding a meaning from you, and that if you can just find the key, then you will reveal those meanings. Well, I'd like to think that time is the key. Careful reading, thoughtful reading, these are the ways that we will reveal the beauty, the inner meaning of a poem. As well as time, there are a few things that we need to remember, things about poems that go back over time. If you remember these things, then you are likely to reach more interesting interpretations. These are some things to remember about poetry. First, poems are small and dense and compact. They're little literary objects that are able to contain multiple interpretations. Poets work with and against poetic conventions. Now, these conventions are rules and they're developed over a considerable amount of time. At times of social and artistic upheaval, these rules are challenged and changed. Compositional devices help poets to create effects, emotional effects. Does a poem make us sad or happy? Are we downcast or uplifted? Form and content work in a relationship, so the shape and the organisation of the poem will sometimes reflect the content of the poem, but at other times there's contestation, there's tension and conflict between these two aspects of the poem. Finally, embrace ambiguity. multiple interpretations are available within the poem, and new interpretations do not cancel out earlier ones. Embrace ambiguity, look for it, and be able to explain it. So could we think about approaching poetry as having a toolkit, and that we use different approaches to reveal different things? Well, I want us to think just briefly about what aspects, what devices a poet has available to her or him, and what we should look for in a poem when we're initially approaching it. So I want you to think about what aspects of poetry you know about and what you would look for. And then I want you to think briefly about what these devices, what effect these devices have on the reader. Like I say, I can think of 12, but there's more, many more. But let's start with those, and then we'll talk about a few of them. Here's my list. How did you do? I've highlighted the ones that we're going to look at today, but let's have a look at all of them briefly before we move on. So rhyme is probably the thing that we're most familiar with. Rhyme is the repetition of a sound at the end of lines. Sometimes those lines are next to each other, and sometimes they're alternating, and sometimes it's more complex than that. But rhyme is a repetition that carries us forward through the poem, but also backwards. So it has an organising capacity. Rhythm or meter, the number of stresses in a line, the number of syllables, and this was rhyme and rhythm were very kind of consistently adhered to aspects of poetry right up to the beginning of the 20th century. And from the beginning of the 20th century, we had much more poetic innovation, and this has been associated with the rise of modernity and modernism. And basically, as the world changed, poets wanted poetry to change to reflect that. One of the other things we can do is just look at the poem and see what it appears like on the page. There are things that we can say about a poem before we even read it. We can talk about the number of lines and the number of stanzas, the length of the lines, that kind of thing. Punctuation. Poets speed up and slow down the human voice by adding full stops, commas, colons and semicolons, exclamation marks. These things add texture to the poem. We talk about enjambment and caesura. Enjambment is when a line runs on. Caesura is when it stops, and you can see that this will have an effect on the way the human voice communicates the poem. Don't forget that the poem was meant to be spoken. The word lyrical comes from the musical instrument the lyre, L-Y-R-E, as an only stringed instrument, a bit like a guitar. And poems would be accompanied musically as people spoke them, because in pre-literate societies, poems would be passed on from one person to another. We need to think about language. Poems are made of language. They're made of words. How does the poet use words? So think carefully about the choice of words. Words create images. So imagery is really important in poetry. And we'll talk about how imagery, metaphor, simile, these things all work together. But these are all important in creating the effect that I was talking about earlier, the way that we are emotionally manipulated, if you like, by the poet. So when we think about images, winter, autumn, dark and dull colours make us think of sad things. They make us think perhaps of growing old and the end of life, whereas spring and summer, bright colours, vibrant images might make us think of new life, birth and renewal. Repetitions and developments, things occur just like rhyme, the sounds of the rhyme do, more than once in a poem quite often, and the poet is drawing our attention to this. So think about things happening more than once, words being used more than once, images being used more than once? Are they always used in the same way, or is there a development? Are things being shifted and transformed as the poem advances? The poetic voice. Where is the poet? Is there an I? We think of an I in a poem as being the poet in a way that we don't with the narrator or the narrative voice in a novel. We don't think this is the novelist. So we should be thoughtful about that and give it some consideration. Then who is the poet speaking to? Is it an intimate poem addressed to someone close, to a lover perhaps, or a child, a parent, someone who's been lost, for example, in a eulogy or an elegy? So who is the poet speaking to? Is it a general address to all of mankind, or a very specific address to one person? And then context. This is really important. We need to think about what kind of world the poem emerges into and what it's responding to. Here's our poem then for today. It's called Meeting at Night by Robert Browning, a mid-19th century poem, so a Victorian poem. The grey sea and the long black land, and the yellow half moon large and low, and the startled little waves that leap in fiery ringlets from their sleep, as I gain the cove with pushing prow and quench its speed in the slushy sand. Then a mile of warm sea-scented beach, 3 fields to cross till a farm appears, a tap at the pane, the quick sharp scratch and blue spurt of a lighted match, and a voice less loud through its joys and fears than the 2 hearts beating each to each. Browning was an unconventional poet of the mid-19th century. He was involved in a passionate relationship with fellow poet Elizabeth Barrett, and they go on to marry, despite the disapproval of their families. So we can see from a contextual basis that he's an unconventional figure, challenging the morality of the Victorian period in which he lived. So structure, but there's something obvious to say here, isn't there? There's 2 stanzas, but we can go on and say something more. It's 2 stanzas of 6 lines each. We call these sestets. It's important to use the technical vocabulary of poetry and poetic analysis. We can also say that actually these 2 stanzas divide the action. The first stanza takes place in a boat and predominantly on the sea. The second stanza organises the walk from the beach to the farmhouse for this meeting, the meeting that is promised in the title. Just briefly on structure, just counting the lines can tell us something. This is a very famous poem, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. We know it's a sonnet because it's got 14 lines. So without even reading it, we can say something interesting. The sonnet, an Italian word meaning little song, again that idea of poetry as a spoken or a sung form, is traditionally a form of poetry. It comes from Italy and is associated with courtly love. So this too is a love poem, but not really a conventional one. But there are things we can also say about the organisation of rhyme and about how that affects the organisation of the material in the poem. I'm sure you're very familiar with rhyme scheme, but I've popped the pattern against the end of each line there to show the way in which Shakespeare has used it to divide up the content that he's trying to communicate to his reader, and the way in which in a sonnet, although it looks like 14 lines on the page, in reading it there's a division between the 3 quatrains and the rhyming couplet at the end. The effect of course, is to show that there's a proposition that's set up, a tension or a conflict, and that this is then ultimately resolved by the rhyming couplet, that shift in rhyme pattern at the very end. So what effect does rhyme scheme have on our poem? Well, it's very different to the effect that Shakespeare has achieved. Instead of being AB, AB, CD, CD, and so on, we have ABC, CBA. So we have a rhyming couplet in the middle of a stanza. This is extremely unusual. We could see this as unconventional. We can see this as breaking the rules. The first and sixth, second and fifth lines rhyme. And then, as I say, the rhyme scheme meets in the middle. And we have, of course, a poem about a meeting. So we have the content of the poem following the form that Browning has established for it. Content and form in a close relationship. We could also perhaps think about the fact that that first stanza is about a person in a boat on little waves that rise and fall. So we have this sort of sense of a waveform of rising towards a peak and then falling away. So that also reflects the content of the poem, the way in which the action, if you like, is one of rising and falling. And again, the second stanza reinforces that with the walking, the rising and falling action of the walker, or perhaps rising to the crest of a hill and seeing the farm laid out before them. So we get a real sense of the way in which the rhyme scheme shapes the content and organises the action. We've seen so far how Browning has used some of the poetic devices available to him to shape his little poem. We've seen how the two stanzas organise the action from the sea to the land. We've seen how the rhyme scheme concentrates the attention of the reader on these rhyming couplets, not at the end of stanzas to resolve conflicts, but in the middle to create a crescendo. We could also observe the way in which he uses punctuation to reinforce that, with enjambment with these central couplets. Can we also say something about the language and imagery that he incorporates into it, and say something about how the structure is organised on an even more detailed level than just into two stanzas? And I think you can see from the colours and the highlighting that I've done here that it is. So that those first two lines are characterised by the use of colours, grey, black, yellow. The middle couplet on the first stanza is all about adjectives and adverbs and about active language and imagery, startled, fiery. And then the third one, we have alliteration and we have sibilance with a pushing prow and its speed, slushy sand. So you can see the way in which the poet wants to draw our attention as readers to particular moments in the poem. The second stanza is much more about the senses. It's a sensual stanza, scented, appearing. And then this middle couplet, tap, scratch, spurt, light. Again, we've got some alliteration, but also we have very short words that are very staccato. Tap, the, pain, quick, sharp, scratch. So monosyllabic. And it draws our attention. It's the language and the rhyme, the rhyming couplet, and the idea of things happening in the middle of the stanza draw our attention. And then this final one is about the outpouring of emotion. But what I'd say that these moments do, particularly the last two lines of the first stanza and the rhyming couplet of the second stanza, is they draw our attention to perhaps a deeper interpretation that we could arrive at. We can see the language here is actually very sensual, and we could also see perhaps that the way in which Browning is using his language is quite suggestive. Don't forget, he's a morally and aesthetically unconventional figure in Victorian literary scene. So perhaps we can use our knowledge of context to read some of the ambiguity into the language that I spoke of at the beginning. We could see the match perhaps as a phallic symbol, and the use of language, scratch, spurt and light. These are all to do with kind of releases, if you like. And then if we use that knowledge and go back into the first stanza, we can see that a pushing prow and slushy sand are suggestive of sex and sexuality, and that, you know, this covert meeting is happening under the cover of night because it's illicit. And so this is perhaps a sexual relationship which breaks Victorian moral codes. And then if we sort of work back through the poem, as I suggested right at the beginning, that rhyme encourages us to do, it moves forwards and backwards. We perhaps might see the landscape not just as the landscape of the seashore, but actually the sort of the landscape of a lover's body. This slide then illustrates that division, not just between stanzas, but also between each pair of lines as we move through the poem. We can divide it first into two stanzas and then into these 6 couplets. So, a quick summary. Back to that idea, dense in meaning. There's a lot to say about just these few 12 short lines. The poem is both narrative, it tells a story, but it's also symbolic. There's lots of organisation going on through rhyme scheme, through structure, through imagery. And then we see the way in which the rhyme scheme organises that and patterns that meaning, and the way in which this idea of meeting, this crescendo, this sort of release is both to do with what's happening in the poem, but also kind of the symbolic qualities that the poem has. And the language patterns meaning just as much as rhyme scheme and look on the page. That's all from me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mark. That's really great. I must admit, poetry isn't something that I've read a lot about, but I think I should go and visit some poetry after this. So I think we've just got a couple of questions to finish off the session. So I don't know if Kate's still there as well. What I was going to start with, maybe Mark, if I can direct these questions to you initially, is why do you think people should study English?
Well, English has a sort of fundamental place in the sort of national debate. People refer back to as what is it to be British? What is it to be English? What is it to be European? What is it sometimes to be human? And they locate often the way that we talk about these things in stories, in narratives, in literary histories. So, you know, from a British perspective, we often draw upon Shakespeare and Chaucer, but also Dickens and Austen, and then Orwell and sort of Angela Carter, and all sorts of interesting and varied people. And we draw upon those stories that they tell to reflect on the stories that we tell ourselves. So storytelling, I think, is at the centre of that. But for studying it, it's also very interesting to see the way in which how those stories are told changes over time. I think once you get to university level, that's what we're most interested in, not what happens in a story, but how it's told and how those changes take place at different points. So that thing I was talking about in the little video about modernism and modernity, when poetry changes fundamentally after centuries of being quite static and sort of rigid, is a really significant point where literature changes. So sort of how we tell the stories to ourselves about who we are changes at various points due to these these upheavals that I spoke about, social and aesthetic.
Great. Okay. And Kate, maybe I could ask you, what kind of careers do people with English degrees go on to?
Thanks, Mark. And Mark, it was really interesting to watch the poetry video and just reflect on something like when Mark was just talking. I was really interested in what you were saying about how relevant English is. I think it's very broad, the sorts of careers that English graduates go into, not least because of some of those really sophisticated problem-solving skills that Mark was alluding to with the poetry analysis. So I think English, where in the past perhaps English has been seen as kind of quite niche and elitist and quite small, I think you can see that in talking about stories for everyone. And I think our curriculum now has broadened to such an extent that we're telling lots of different sorts of stories than perhaps people who might have studied English 20 or 30 years ago were doing. So I think in that sense, our kind of the relevance of those stories is more pertinent now and appreciated by a really wide range of employers. So to sort of answer the question sort of directly in terms of what sorts of jobs, I mean, it speaks very literally to things like publishing, writing, careers, anything to do with communication skills. Also, I think you know, teaching, obviously that's always been a very popular destination for our graduates. But also increasingly, I think a lot of the business world, accountancy, the sorts of jobs where people are required to present, to analyse, to communicate clearly. And I think in the modern workplace, that's pretty much everywhere. So it's having a sense of those, using what we try and encourage our undergraduates to think about is those skills that they've gained, and that knowledge that they've gained about themselves, about being able to communicate effectively, being able to analyse and solve problems, and work with other people solving those problems, and using words really effectively to get over their own case or their own argument. So I think the traditional routes are still very popular, but I think increasingly we've got a kind of wider, you know, I think we're finding our graduates going to kind of interesting and diverse careers all across lots of different sectors.
Yeah, I've forgotten now the exact figure, but I think it's something like 60% of people go on to jobs which actually aren't directly related to the degree they do, because employers are more interested in the skills that people have developed throughout their degree than what the actual subject is. Which I suppose brings me on to another question. What do you think makes a good English student? What kind of qualities should they have?
Do you want me to answer this?
That could be to either of you.
Go on, Mark, you go first.
We always say to our incoming students, the thing that they must bring with them is a passion for literature, a passion for reading, and a curiosity, intellectual curiosity. One of the great joys, I think, of the study of English at degree level is that that broadness, that diversity that Kate was talking about. You know, we teach post-colonial literature, we teach eco-criticism, but we teach Shakespeare and the Victorians, which is you know, what you expect to see on an English degree. But beyond that, we have a great deal of freedom as sort of teachers at degree level to put on those books that we find fascinating. So what our students often find is they're reading stuff that they didn't expect to read, and that they find that really fulfilling. You know, you know, they say things like, I wouldn't normally have read something like this, but you know, now I want to read more of some quite often quite obscure literature. So we really challenge them to think about what reading is and what analysis is, and encourage them to broaden their horizons as much as possible.
I think that's a really great answer.
That's great. And actually that brought me on.
Sorry, go on.
It brings me on quite nicely to my next question. About how much flexibility is there, you know, if someone's coming with a love of a particular author, for example, or a particular genre, how much flexibility is there within degree courses, maybe to try and focus on something like that, Kate?
Yeah, generally I'd say that most English degrees have a fairly rigid first year, which acts as a transition between A-level study, which is quite particular, because you look in depth at a kind of small number of texts in order to get an idea of those skills, those analytical skills that I was talking about. So to act as a bridge, generally the first year is a place where we sort of show our students lots of different sorts of texts, lots of different sorts of assessment, different genre, different periods, so that they get a feel for what they find interesting, and to do what Mark was saying, kind of to broaden their horizons and say, you might not have thought of reading this before, you might have not had an opportunity to read this other author, but here they are. And then I think as degrees increasing, there are increasing amounts of options and flexibility. So by second year, there'll be some choice built in, and by the final year, presumably, you know, we have options. And I think most other degree English degrees across the country have many more options built from people's research areas and the things that they're interested in. And also the flexibility to write a dissertation quite often on a topic that absolutely fascinates you, that you've perhaps been thinking about for a few years, and to work with somebody, with one or two supervisors, developing your ideas, your passion, and working with academics who've been studying that author as well. So I think, yeah, there are increasing amounts of flexibility as you go through your degree, but what we also want to do is what Mark suggested, which is that kind of horizon broadening, because nobody wants to read the same author for 3 years. Well, they might do for 3 years if you go to do a PhD, I suppose, but in that initial stage, you know, we want to broaden people's horizons, and we want for them to encounter new things and learn new stories, because that's what English literature is about. It's about seeing the world through other people's eyes and learning about other people's perspectives.
Okay, and I'm just conscious there may be some people watching the video who aren't quite sure what you mean by a dissertation. So do you just want to explain exactly what a dissertation is?
Yes, so a dissertation is a longer piece of writing. Our dissertation is, this is probably terrifying to people who are writing shorter pieces of coursework of a couple of thousand words. Our dissertations are about 8,000 words. But we break it down into a series of essays, and they get a whole year to study for this with, as I say, with one or two supervisors who work with them and help them to direct their reading and do their research, and really investigate a topic in lots and lots of detail. So it's a real chance to immerse yourself in a topic that you're interested in and develop your ideas with experts who will help you to sort of structure that piece of work and present a really authoritative account of that particular topic area or author or genre. So yeah, that's a dissertation, just a longer piece of writing.
Okay, that's great. And just a final question for Mark. Obviously, the word unprecedented is probably overused these days, but many young people may have had quite a strange experience of studying at sixth form and may not have covered the full curriculum of their courses that they're studying at the moment. Should they be concerned about how that might impact on them when they get to university?
No, they shouldn't. They shouldn't. We're not interested in how many books somebody has read. And really, I think, and I hope Kate would agree with this, an English degree isn't about cramming in as many books as possible and then being able to show off that you've read, this or that, or you can quote directly from Shakespeare or whatever. We're not interested in that. What we're interested in is people who are careful, thoughtful readers, people who can analyze and interpret. It's about your approach to books, about what you come to understand, not what you know. Hopefully, by the time that people leave university, they don't know a lot about books. They know how to come to understand how things fit together, how a body of a writer's work develops and transforms over time, how they relate to other writers from the same period, and again with that idea of a literary tradition. So that's about understanding rather than knowing stuff.
Okay, that's great. I said that was the final question, but I just thought of one more, which I thought we should do, seeing as we're doing English today. And that is, if you have one book you could recommend to people to go away and read, what would your recommendation be?
That's a really difficult one, and I'm going to go back to I'm going to fall back on my choice of lecture material, which was Frankenstein, because I think it really I don't know whether Mark's found this and his colleagues have found this, but over this year I found that English has been, because of perhaps the situation that we found ourselves, I think people have relied on literature more to tell us stories about who we are and to try and understand ourselves. And I think Frankenstein does that really well, because it speaks to all those concerns about science and all those debates that we've been having about the extent to how much we meddle with the natural world and the effect and the impact that has on human beings. And it talks about, it's a very sophisticated text in the way that Mary Shelley, as I tried to say, she drew on a lot of other texts in the composition of that particular one. And I think it's interesting in terms of travel and mobility and how we move around our planet, but also about what it means to be human. It really gets to the heart of, by creating a human, what does Victor Frankenstein create? Who are we, and what does it mean to be part of this world? So yes, I'm gonna recommend everybody goes away. If you haven't already, go away and read Frankenstein.
Okay, that's great. And Mark, what would your top recommendation be?
It's so difficult. It is so difficult. Do you go for something classical? I'm a big fan of Pride and Prejudice. I think that speaks to us today still. But I'm gonna perhaps go a bit more modern. My field's contemporary. But I am going to pick up a little bit on that, and maybe we shouldn't be reading this at this time, in these unprecedented times, as you say they are. And that's Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which I think actually picks up on many of those themes that Kate's just been talking about, and that Shelley is talking about in her novel, about what it is to be human, what it is to survive, what it is to have a soul. But what's so wonderful about The Road is while you're reading about that, you can read about, you can think about what it is to tell a story and how it can be told. It's such a beautifully crafted novel, and it's innovative. It changes the way that we think about how you narrate a story. But it is utterly miserable.
Well, I haven't read that, so I should go away and pick up on your recommendation. I'd just like to thank you both for your time this afternoon and for sharing your thoughts